Hello and welcome to the best breakout session that you're going to attend at 2020 Migration. Um, I have loved this conference since it began. I've been to every single one of them except one when I was grossly sick. And so even in the reality that is COVID, I'm glad that migration is still going on. And though I can't be in a room with you all facing your scorn and ridicule as I usually do, I'm very happy to be able to come to you and present what I think is a kind of important topic on flight instruction, how we can maybe be more aware of what's going on in our industry, and then also maybe look at some practical strategies to increasing the quality of flight instructors in our community. So without further ado, we're going to jump into the presentation. So I titled this presentation, CFI, Can't Fully Instruct, not in order to throw darts at anybody, but to face the reality that is flight instructor training and certification in our community, and to really focus on maybe the second line, which is building qualified flight instructors, not just certificated ones, but qualified ones, and looking specifically at how we can do that. So if you like what you hear in this presentation, my name is Eric Crump, and by day, I'm the Aerospace Program Director at Polk State College in Lakeland, Florida, where we train anywhere between 80 and 100 or so pilots a semester. We also offer programs in aviation maintenance, dispatch, administration, all the usual things you'd find at an aviation college program. By evening, I also get the distinct privilege of being able to co-own an aviation consultancy company called Red Aviation, in which I'm a co-principal. I like to develop curricula, specifically focused around flight simulation, which is one of the many reasons why me and the Redbird folks have always gotten along pretty well, because we understand the value of flight simulation, initial pilot training, recurrent training, all the way through. However, it's inevitable. Every once in a while, somebody doesn't like my presentation. And if you've been to one of mine before, you know that I tell you every year, if you don't like this presentation, if you don't like the content, or if you don't like the presenter, my name is Charlie Gregoire, and I run the show at Redbird Flight Simulations. So just to be clear, if you like it, Eric Crump. If you hate it, my name is Charlie. Okay, that's enough of that. Let's talk about what we're going to talk about. We're going to go through your typical three-pronged presentation. First of all, just looking at the current CFI situation that exists in numbers and scope, and sort of just the reality of the flight instructor community. We'll try to define if there is in fact a problem in flight instructor training, certification, and oversight. And if there is, and I believe there is, if there is really a problem there, what do we actually do about it? How can we be proactive about solving that problem? And so I was also told that I had to also provide a warning if anything that we were going to cover in this particular presentation was of a graphic nature. And so what you're about to see does contain graphic content, very literally. So first of all, let's talk about the total CFI population. If you don't like graphs and numbers and charts, maybe just doze off for a few minutes and come back, and we'll be talking about stuff that does not include numbers. And also, just to make sure you're awake, for some reason I set the x-axis of this chart backwards. So 2019 is on the left side and 2010 is on the right. Just go with it. Every year, if you didn't know this, the FAA publishes civil airman statistics on their website, and it contains all kinds of very useful information dealing with pilot certification, practical test pass results, knowledge test pass results are in a separate file as well. It's a great place to go to sort of get an idea about what's going on in our industry. It also, if you look at the State of GA presentation that AOPA puts out every year, a lot of their data comes from this same place. So you can go and download the Excel format file on your own and look at it if you wish. I've pulled in a few things that I think are pertinent to our discussion today. If you look at the total number of active CFI certificates, and we're going to talk about what the word active means in a little bit, so just go with it for right now. You see this not just linear, but it's getting to the point where it's really starting to skyrocket upward. You could draw a trend line here that has a really nice upward slant on it. And what this is telling us is that there are just more and more and more active CFI certificates being held, particularly as we look at this 10-year period. We see this increase as things were starting to recover around 2012, 2013. That's when that line started peaking again. And then as we started to see the impacts of increased pilot hiring at the airlines, cadet programs, all these things, airlines sending pilot recruiters, whoever thought that would happen, out to flight schools begging and begging for flight instructors to come and fill their ranks. You started to see that number tick up. And then in the last couple of years, really a skyward climb, a huge increase from 2018 to 2019. Yes, I know some events happened in the world this particular year, so it'll be interesting to see what this data looks like when the 2020 data comes out next year. But at any rate, what we're really just trying to understand is the incredible growth in training and certification of CFIs. Okay, which is also directly shown here, maybe in a little bit more granularity. This is the number of new CFI certificates issued over this 10-year period. And even though the number of active CFIs continued to follow that linear track, notice the number of new CFI issuances was still going down until 2013, peaks up in 2014, comes back down in 2015, starts increasing, and then lo and behold, around 2017, you start to see this upward trend line really starting to peak up again. In 2019, we issued almost 8,000 new CFI certificates. More on that in a second. Stay with me. When we look at the pilot, this is overall pilot certificates, I'll get it out in a second, that are held by each age group. You notice that you start to see this peak around the 25, 29 level. It starts to come back down into the mid 40s, and you see this other peak start to happen mid to late 50s and into 60s. So there's a bit of an M curve here, if you want to call it that, in two different peaks with a valley in between. However, look at what happens when we look at CFI certificates held by age group. We start to see that this trend actually goes up much steeper, up into mid to late 30s, and then it's a slow and steady decline after that from 40 onward, which could mean a couple of different things. It could mean that older flight instructors are just letting their CFI certificate lapse because maybe they're in a career job at an airline or a corporate flight department, or they just don't need the CFI certificate anymore. They don't want to go through the trouble of a FERC or of actually doing renewal activities, and so they just let the CFI go. The important thing about this data to me is that we have this large spike, large difference in the number of younger CFIs. And that doesn't mean that somebody in their 60s isn't getting their initial CFI certificate. Certainly they could, and that happens all the time. But when you look at the data side by side, you start to notice that a lot, like a vast majority, over 80% of those new CFI certificates being issued are being issued to that under 40 demographic. This is important because when you compare the CFI certificate numbers with the pilot certificate numbers, only 17% of pilot certificate holders are also flight instructors. So even though the number of flight instructors that are active, and we'll talk again about what that means in a second, and even though we're issuing a ton of CFI certificates, it's still a super small minority of the overall pilot population. Now, maybe you guys all know this. Maybe this is all just, well, yeah, Eric, we already knew that before. Or again, if you're not liking the presentation, my name is Charlie. Maybe you already knew all this stuff. That's fine. But let's get into these numbers a little bit more specifically and try to figure out what they tell us about our CFI population. Active CFI values from the FAA's data are not super reliable because to be active, quote unquote, you have to have a CFI certificate and a valid medical certificate. Well, now we all know that most flight instructors, if they're not doing initial pilot training, are not required to hold a medical certificate unless the school or insurance or some other requirement mandates it. The medical is not required unless you're doing initial pilot training. So there could be more folks out there that are flight instructors that don't have a medical, but this is also going to include people who have a pilot certificate, have a CFI certificate, and a medical, but do no instruction. So those active CFI values are super meeting. When we actually look at the overall population, these are estimates, conservatively speaking, of that 113,000 active quote unquote CFI certificates, we estimate that only about 12,000 active GA flight instructors are working in the United States. And when I say active, I mean people who are performing pilot training toward a certificate or rating. Now, there are probably plenty more who are doing type specific work, who are doing transition training and all sorts of other stuff. Maybe they're doing some training as part of their job in a 135 or 121 operation. I'm talking about people who are doing initial pilot certification in GA. Okay, so that's a really small minority of that overall active population. Now, again, we know from the data that we issued almost 8,000 initial CFI certificates in 2019. That means that 2/3 of our active CFI population is brand new to flight instruction. They're brand new instructors. They have wet ink on their CFI certificate. 2/3 of our CFI population are inexperienced. I'll let that sink in for a second. Okay, now let's move on. Before COVID, airline hiring forecasts exceeded 2,000 flight instructors a year through 2026. Who knows how long it's going to take for everything to get back on? No one knows. Everybody can make a guess. You could probably go to Vegas and get pretty decent odds on whatever your guess is. But we know that there was a huge, what I call CFI suck into professional aviation above the instructional level. And when hiring turns back on, we expect that phenomenon will continue because we still had a pilot shortage before COVID, and we've coupled that with a bunch of new retirements and potentially a reduction in overall starts in flight training. We don't know exactly what the impact of that's going to be yet. Of all the things I'm probably going to tell you in the next couple of minutes, this may be the most important part. What this is telling us is that less than 25%, less than a quarter of the active CFI population translates its experience from one year to the next. So those gone are the days of intense tribal knowledge where flight instructors worked for years, became check instructors and chief instructors, and taught a whole new and mentored a whole new generation of flight instructors. Those days are behind us. They've been behind us for a long time, and we've definitely started to see that in initial pilot training. We have a core of flight instructors that mean well, that I legitimately believe want to do the right thing. But you can't combat the fact that you have no experience if you have no experience. All right, so we have to start there. Let's just accept the fact that a lot of our CFI population is brand new and inexperienced. That doesn't mean they're bad. Some of them have a hunger and a thirst, and they really want to be the best instructor imaginable. That's good. It's healthy. But we need to be able to shape and manage that. So how do we do that? That's a great question. Let's talk about success points. And when I say success points, I mean test results. First attempt check ride pass rate for the CFI hovers just below 70%. It goes up, it goes down from the mid 60s to just over 70%. But on average, somewhere around 68-ish%, your first time check ride pass rate. It's the lowest of all FA pilot certifications and generally about 10% lower than the overall pilot pass rate for all pilot certifications. Now you're thinking, well, of course it is, because it's the hardest check ride you're going to take. Maybe the ATP, though I've heard airline pilots say they would rather take their ATP upside down on fire again before they would ever retake their CFI practical test. And there may be some truth to that. I'm going to try to connect the dots on this if I understand it, and then maybe we can put it together after the fact. However, when we look at CFI testing, knowledge test results paint a completely different picture about the CFI population. The FIA exam, flight instructor airplane, has a 96% pass rate with an 88% average score. That's impressive. The FOI, fundamentals of instruction, 90% pass rate, 96% pass rate, 89% average score. So these people must be super qualified to be a flight instructor, right? I mean, 96% pass rates, above 80, almost 90% average scores on these tests. They should go to their CFI practical test and just nail it, right? Something's not translating. Is it really that just flight instructors are sitting down memorizing knowledge test questions still, and regurgitating that on a knowledge test and not really learning anything? Possibly, probably. That's a fair, reasonable expectation, I guess. The interesting thing that I've seen in training and seeing CFIs go through certification is this complete lack of practicality in how we train flight instructors. Because, and I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about this, and it's cool if I am. I'm sure there's some way for you to let me know, and I'm totally cool to have that conversation with you. But we're training flight instructors to train their DPE on a check ride, are we not? Is that not what we're preparing them for? We're preparing them to pass the check ride. Well, that's fine, but the DPE isn't really a student. The DPE knows more than the applicant, theoretically, hopefully. So when we see this huge disparity between knowledge test results and practical test results, it's telling me that the way we're training, something's wrong here. It doesn't pass the smell test. Because just like our practical test pass rate is 10% lower than the overall pilot average, knowledge test results for CFIs are 10% higher than the overall pilot pass average. I find it hard to believe that flight instructors have this increased knowledge base and just can't communicate it. I have a hard time believing it. It might be true, but I think there's something else to this. Maybe there is actually a problem. Let's try to investigate that a little bit. Where do the flight instructors come from? In 2019, we did a version of this breakout session where it was audience participation. Everybody sort of texted in answers, and I captured that data because I wanted to use it again this year anyway. I wanted to do it in person, but this will work. From our migration breakout, these are flight instructors, flight school owners, pilot examiners that were in this breakout group. Here's what we learned. 70% of the flight schools represented in that room had issues finding quality flight instructors. They could find people to work for them, but finding people who were qualified to do the job, 70% of flight schools reported issues with that. 60% of those flight schools consistently experienced delaying CFI turnover, meaning that the CFI turnover was happening at a rate that it was delaying the training of students enrolled in those flight schools because of the rate of CFI turnover. What were the primary issues? 64% of schools and flight instructors and DPs, the group represented, said it was knowledge. But hold on a second. The knowledge test had a 96% pass rate with almost a 90% passing score. Again, something's not adding up here. Work ethic came in next, being on time, wanting to do the job well, being committed to what they were doing, having people skills. And I was actually a little surprised by this, to be honest with you. I figured that more people would complain about stick and rudder skills. But then when I really thought about this from my own experience training and certifying our flight instructors, I had to agree with this. I think my CFIs were really great with stick and rudder skills. I don't know that they're as qualified as they should be about communicating that in an understandable way to a new student. But really, when I thought about it, I didn't have a huge issue with their personal stick and rudder skills. I definitely always have issues with CFIs having the right level of knowledge to not only know the thing and regurgitate it, but be able to explain it to a student. Okay, let's move on. So why aren't there more good CFIs to choose from? Again, same group of people. 34% said we're not paying flight instructors enough. We need to pay them more. If we paid them more, we'd have better flight instructors. 24% said poor training. 24% came in with airline, and again, these numbers aren't going to add up. You could pick multiple answers. Airline poaching was in there at 24%, and the high cost of training overall was there at 15%. I think the CFI pay question is interesting, and I would love to do a whole breakout just on CFI pay. I want to do that one in person, though, because I want to ask you guys a bunch of questions. The poor training thing, though, it's interesting to me that pops up. If we're not satisfied with the quality of flight instructors, these are people who hold a certificate who are applying for a job. If we're not happy with their quality, and we know it's a result partially of poor training, seems to me that maybe that's our problem. Maybe it's the way we're training flight instructors. Maybe if we went back to basics and focused on that, maybe we would see something different. I will say again, especially on this airline poaching thing, I'm not trying to predict what will happen in our industry in terms of needs and demands, definitely over the next 18 to 24 months. maybe longer, maybe shorter, but that period of time, I have no idea what's going to happen. I'm just trying to give you data that's admittedly a year old. All right. So for me, it all starts with goals and objectives. What is the primary motivator for a pilot to become a flight instructor? I ask my flight instructor applicants this all the time, and I tell them straight up, if your answer has anything to do with, I want to do this for a little while so I can go get a quote unquote real job, you need to find another not real job. Because if you don't view flight instruction as a professional, legitimate pursuit, I don't need you in an airplane with my flight students, period. But it's a fact of life. We know it no matter how much we try to avoid it. Many pilots seek to become flight instructors because it is a guaranteed frontline position in some cases that gets you time, that gets you paid to build flight time so that you can go fly something that's shiny and metal and compressed with compressed air inside. And so I get it. I want this to stop, and I want people to stop thinking about CFI as not a real job, but I know it's still in the back of people's heads. These questions I'm going to ask you together. What's the primary focus of a student during CFI training, and what's the primary motivation for a school training CFI students? They both want to pass the practical test. That's what they're focusing on. A student may be like, I really want to get this down so I can be a good flight instructor. And I'm sure they believe that in their heart of hearts. But in reality, all they're thinking practical test. The instructor who's training them and the flight school who's signing them off is thinking about that practical test. The goal is to train them to pass the test. And we sit them down and we say, now make sure you don't train your students just to pass the test because they need to be better than that. And then we're like the pot and the kettle calling each other black. And then we teach the instructors with this motivation of, we really got to focus on this practical. And it's going to be a long oral. It's going to be an intense flight. It's very different. We got to learn all the differences. Let's find somebody's DPE gouge so we can be as prepared as possible so that we can pass the practical test. If that's our goal, I think we've missed the point. And then at that point, I don't know why we can be surprised at the quality of candidates that we get, because we're not training, my opinion, just my opinion. I don't know that we're training qualified flight instructors. I think we're training certificated flight instructors. And I think we can do better than that. I think there's something there. There's something we can do. And so I want to end with this. How do we get in front of it? If you're with me so far and you haven't already turned it off, again, if you're still here and you're not having a good time, Charlie Gregoire. If you're into it and you're like, man, best migration session I've ever been to, Eric Crump. Let's talk about how we can fix these problems. What's needed? What do we need to do? I think we have to start with a new focus in initial CFI training. I think we have to look at training beyond the test. Yes, they still have to pass the test, but particularly if I'm training a flight instructor, I'm probably thinking about whether or not I'm going to hire that flight instructor. So I might want to train them beyond just being able to pass that test. I think we should include more practical teaching, not practice teaching with your instructor. Go grab some of your private pilot candidates, have that CFI come in and do some mentored ground school. Have them come in and practice teaching real students, not just their instructor who's going to ask them stupid questions. Real students in a classroom, one-on-one in a pre-brief, whatever it is. Let's do some real practical teaching. Let's include customer service skills. Let's talk about how to explain billing and charges and what my time is worth and how to know when it's the right time to cancel a lesson because somebody's not prepared. And how do you negotiate that, particularly if you're in an environment where you trained with these people and you're friends? How do you become the professional? I think maybe we should teach that too. I think we should definitely teach instructors to know the difference between what formal ground training is and what a pre and post is. Oftentimes, too often, in my experience, I see flight instructors trying to do ground in a pre-brief. It's a briefing. It's not a ground session. If the student is not prepared and the briefing can't be a briefing, then the flight should be canceled and we should do a ground session instead of putting that student in the airplane and wasting their money. If that continues and the student's not prepared, then maybe that professional track CFI or that professional track pilot training thing is maybe not for them. And again, I'm talking about my experience. I've also got some Part 61 local flight school experience. You're like, well, we're not going to run people off if they're not prepared because that's more ground time. Listen, I don't care about whether you keep them and you train them more. I'm just saying, let's teach instructors to know the difference. Let's teach instructors to know when they're in ground mode and when they're in pre and post mode so that they're giving good evaluations, good assessments to students so they're prepared for that stuff when they go to a stage check or an EOC, or in the case of Part 61, when they go to a check ride. Back to the evaluation thing, let's teach instructors to evaluate, not just for whatever the DP is going to do dumb during their maneuver demo, but really, like, how am I making a determination about what is SAT and what is unsat? Do I understand why it's not healthy to give a student an incomplete grade when they deserve an unsat? Do I understand why it's important for them to get the unsat so they know where to go back and retrain? I don't know. I don't know if that's being done across the board. I know we could do a better job of teaching evaluation. I see it all the time. And I see it every time I try to promote an instructor to be a check instructor. It's like going back to the basics. You can't teach them now. This is an evaluation. You have to stop talking, let them fly, and then critique at the end. I like the idea of some kind of program that bridges us from the certification process to pilot training. And this is more than just a standardization program. I'm talking about 3 very specific core areas. So before we even get to standardization, some kind of practice or observation program where they can sit in on a pre-brief. Maybe they can, even if you can't get somebody in the back of an airplane, maybe record some lessons and let them watch a senior instructor provide instruction in the aircraft. But some form of like structured mentoring program where they have a dedicated person they can go and ask questions for. And a lot of schools say, well, we have that. They know they can talk to me whenever. That's fine, but let's do it. Let's do something in structure. Let's have it structured. And let's tell new CFI applicants when they come to work for us, this is the expectation. You're going to be in this mentoring program. You're going to go through this for some period of time before we onboard you. Once we onboard you, we're going to standardize you. We're going to standardize you for practices and procedures and also for customer service, because the CFI is the frontline employee that student is dealing with on every flight lesson. They're in the airplane with them, right next to them. And just as important as a front desk person is, or an accounting person, and they are for sure, the flight instructor touches all of those other functions. They're the hub to the wheel that is your school. And so we need to be onboarding flight instructors, in my opinion, with better customer service skills too. At that point, then we need to look at an oversight program that goes in excess of maybe annual training requirements under 141, but more of a quarterly focus or a monthly focus on particular items that have come up on check rides. We're seeing private pilots go to check rides and they have poor checklist skills. So this month we're going to focus instructor recurrent training on checklist usage and proper checklist training. Some form of oversight program. It's not designed to be punitive and punish people, but really to encourage them to continue to learn and develop their skills, particularly because so many of them are entering this field with no experience, no prior experience anyway. So when it comes to some kind of CFI training thing, we need to ask questions like, how long does it take? What standard are we going to use? We still have a practical test standard for CFI. We're going to wait a while for an ACS standard. So how are we going to incorporate maybe the private and commercial ACSs to take risk management by training, as an example, to a higher level? What materials do we need? When we get to mentoring, is it required? Are you going to require everybody to go through this? I think you should. Do we have specific goals? Do they understand what the outcome is, what we're trying to accomplish? What kind of process are they going to go through? Is this going to be something where they have to log hours and their mentor instructor has to sign off on some kind of a worksheet or grade sheet? I don't know the answer, but some kind of structure needs to exist. When it comes to onboarding, yes, standardization is there, but what kind of testing are we doing? Is it some knowledge testing? Is it flight? Is it both? What's the qualification level? Are we saying, well, as long as you can meet the PTS standard, we're good? I don't think that's appropriate, but what qualification are we going to use? Hopefully maybe a little bit better than the minimum standard. Then when it comes to oversight, what does retraining look like? Do we have flight instructors on contracts for improvement? like probations. We're going to have a probationary contract, or, well, hey, look, you want to get your double I? I want you to get your double I too. I'm going to help you out on the cost and significantly lower the cost to you, but I'm going to put you on a contract. I want you to stay, and if you leave for that time, you got to pay me the money back. Just as an example, I don't have the answers yet. I'm still trying to figure that out. And this breakout last year was very much like this, where we were just snowballing ideas. And I'm still snowballing these ideas, but I think we're a little closer than we were last year. But ultimately, to me, the whole issue here is one of situational awareness, because new CFIs meet the minimum FA standard to obtain a certificate. The PTS says you can be this bad and still be a flight instructor. They're not certified to be experts. And we need to understand that when they get that wet temporary certificate, they're just as green as an experience at being a flight instructor as a new private pilot is. The difference here is, and we joke about this and say that private pilot is a license to learn. Whether you agree with that or not, that's a common phrase. But when we talk about a CFI, we can't have that, because the CFI is a license to teach. And that private pilot applicant who gets in the airplane with that flight instructor assumes they know what they're talking about. You're assuming that they know what they're talking about. As flight school operators, we put all of our eggs in the CFI basket. And if we're really going to do that and be honest with ourselves, that's what we're doing, I think we need to double down on the emphasis and the importance we place in initial CFI training. And if we do that, I think a lot of these other issues will take care of themselves. Again, I don't have all the answers, but I'm trying to figure some of them out. And if you're attending this conference, is that you have the same goal I do. We're all here to learn. We're all here to try to figure out how do we move forward and how do we elevate what we're doing to the next level. I appreciate your participation. My contact information is here. If you have questions or if you want to debate me, I'm cool with that. I like the collaborative nature of this business, and I'm happy to discuss any of these items with you. And I'd love to have your feedback, because I'd like to keep doing this until eventually we can all figure out these answers together. If you think you've got the answers figured out, let me know, because I do want to know. Thank you very much for playing along, and thank you for your participation.